The morning sun hung low over Naval Base San Diego, casting long shadows across the tarmac as the black sedan pulled up to the restricted entry point. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of early hour when the base was transitioning from night operations to day shift, when junior personnel were still bleary-eyed, and the commanding officers hadn't yet settled into their offices with their second cups of coffee. Marcus Sterling had specifically timed his arrival for this window, that golden hour of military operations when people were tired, distracted, and least likely to ask probing questions. He stepped out of the vehicle with deliberate slowness, his movements measured and unremarkable. No urgency, no importance, nothing that would draw attention. His uniform was meticulously pressed but unmarked, standard service dress without the Admiral's insignia that typically preceded him like a trumpet fanfare. To any observer, he was just another officer arriving for duty, though perhaps slightly older than most, his face weathered by decades of service and difficult decisions. His hair, graying at the temples, was cut precisely to regulation. His posture was excellent but not ostentatiously so. Everything about him screamed competence while whispering invisibility. The duffel bag he retrieved from the sedan's trunk was worn leather, scuffed from travel and stained with the patina of 1,000 deployments. No officer's valise, no elegant luggage, just the practical gear of a working soldier. He slung it over his shoulder with the ease of someone who'd carried heavier burdens both literally and metaphorically. A young soldier at the checkpoint, Petty Officer Third Class Rodriguez, according to his name tag, barely glanced up from his clipboard. "Welcome to Base San Diego, sir. Name and unit assignment." Marcus had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times, had written and rewritten his cover story until it was seamless, believable, and ultimately invisible in its ordinariness. "Marcus Sterling," he said, his voice calm and unremarkable. "Support rotation for SEAL Team 7 operational briefing." He handed over credentials that were entirely genuine, a military ID with all proper clearances, just without the designation that would make junior officers suddenly start snapping salutes and finding him special accommodations. Rodriguez scanned the documents, nodded, and waved him through without a second look. As Marcus walked toward the command compound, a young ensign, couldn't have been more than 23, with eager eyes and the kind of fresh-faced enthusiasm that only comes with first assignment, nearly collided with him. The ensign's eyes widened with automatic concern, the protocol of junior officers everywhere. When you don't recognize someone's rank, assume they're important. "Sir, I'm so sorry. Can I help you with your bag? Are you looking for a specific location?" The young man practically vibrated with the desire to be helpful, to make a good impression on someone whose authority he couldn't yet read. Marcus turned to him with a warm smile, the kind that put people at ease and made them feel seen rather than diminished. "No need, soldier. I've got it. Thank you for asking." He patted the ensign on the shoulder. "You're doing good work here. Keep that attentiveness sharp. It'll serve you well." The ensign's face brightened at the unexpected praise, and he stood taller as Marcus continued walking. This, too, was part of the plan. Small kindnesses, genuine attention. The things that make people remember you not for who you were, but for how you made them feel. Commander Derek Hayes was expecting him, of course. Hayes knew exactly who was arriving and why. Their communication had been encrypted, brief, and conducted through channels so secure that even the base commander wouldn't have full visibility into the conversation. Hayes was the perfect partner for this kind of operation, a man of unshakable integrity who'd commanded elite SEAL teams, who understood the gravity of what was being asked of him, and who was perceptive enough to know that his role was to maintain absolute distance from Marcus in public while ensuring smooth logistics behind closed doors. When Marcus reached the commander's office, Hayes was waiting, and their greeting was perfectly calibrated, professional, cordial, but distant. The distance that says, "I know you, but I can't acknowledge that I know you in any way that would raise questions." "Sterling," Hayes said, extending his hand in a firm handshake. "Good to have you on base. We'll get you situated in the officers' quarters, nothing fancy. You'll have access to the briefing rooms and the Tactical Operations Center. Your clearance is flagged across all systems. Any access you need should process immediately without requiring additional authorization. Appreciated, Marcus replied, his tone casual. I'll try to stay out of everyone's way. Low profile, straightforward observation. This was the beginning of Marcus Sterling's grand experiment in invisibility. At 62 years old, he'd spent the last 40 years climbing the rigid hierarchy of military command. He'd made decisions that affected thousands of lives. He'd stood in war rooms where his words shaped strategy and influenced the fates of nations. But he'd begun to wonder, increasingly, whether people actually respected him for his character, his judgment, his wisdom, or whether they simply obeyed because of the insignia on his chest and the power implicit in his position. Did officers make good decisions because they were good officers, or because they were afraid of disappointing a superior? Did men treat each other with kindness because of their fundamental humanity, or because they calculated that such kindness might be rewarded or that its absence might be punished? This deployment, this silent insertion into a military community that didn't know his true identity, would answer those questions. For the next several weeks, Marcus Sterling would live as a phantom, observing how people behaved when they thought nobody important was watching. He would eat in the enlisted mess alongside junior personnel. He would listen to their conversations and concerns without revealing his position. He would ask questions and accept answers without corrections. And through this careful invisibility, he would learn more about the true character of his military than any official inspection could ever reveal. As he walked through the corridors of Naval Base San Diego that morning, carrying his worn duffel bag and wearing his unmarked uniform, Vice Admiral Marcus Sterling felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine anticipation. Not the weight of command, not the burden of decisions, but simple curiosity about what he might discover when people didn't know they were being observed. The base had no idea that its highest-ranking officer had just arrived in its midst, disguised not in costume but in ordinariness. And that precisely was the point. The first week at Naval Base San Diego unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance where Marcus knew all the steps but pretended to be learning them. He moved through the compound with deliberate aimlessness, arriving at briefings early, sitting in the back row, notebook in hand. The notebook was a genius prop. It gave him purpose without drawing attention. Officers assumed he was recording administrative details, meeting minutes, the kind of clerical work that support staff handled. Nobody questioned why he was there. In the rigid hierarchy of military operations, everyone had a reason to be somewhere, and if you moved with enough confidence, nobody wasted energy asking what that reason was. His quarters were modest. A single room in the junior officers section, Spartan and utilitarian. A narrow bed, a desk, a footlocker. The kind of accommodations that told everyone passing by that this was a working officer, not someone with importance. He could have requested better arrangements. His clearance technically allowed it, but that would have been catastrophically counterintuitive to his mission. Instead, he spent his evenings reviewing classified briefing materials that arrived through secure channels, reading operational reports, and making notes on what he observed during the day. The first security clearance verification happened on Wednesday morning. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, the base's security officer, processed his request for access to classified SEAL operations briefings. She was sharp, professional, with the kind of attention to detail that made her excellent at her job. She reviewed his credentials carefully, cross-referenced his access level with the database, and nodded. Your clearance is already flagged for ops briefings. Commander Hayes must have submitted your access request preemptively. You're good to go anywhere on this base. She didn't question why a support aide needed classified material access. In her experience, commanders requested what they needed, and junior personnel received what they were authorized to receive. The chain of command made its own logic, and her job was to facilitate, not interrogate. By Thursday, Marcus had attended 4 briefings. He sat silently through each one, observing not just the content but the people delivering it. He watched how Major Thomas Rodriguez, the operations officer, presented tactical scenarios. Rodriguez was competent but showed arrogance. A man who assumed his position meant he understood everything about his operational area. When a junior lieutenant asked a clarifying question about supply routes, Rodriguez's eyes flashed with irritation. "If you were paying attention the first time, you wouldn't need clarification," he snapped. The junior officer's face flushed red, and he slumped lower in his chair, asking no further questions for the rest of the briefing. Marcus made a note. Rodriguez was the type who led through intimidation rather than inspiration. In contrast, Captain Jennifer Walsh, the base's intelligence director, conducted her briefings differently. She invited questions, encouraged her team to challenge assumptions, and treated even the youngest ensign as though their input mattered. When Marcus asked a seemingly innocent question about surveillance methodology, "Why was the satellite imagery delayed by 6 hours yesterday?" Walsh didn't dismiss it. Instead, she thanked him for the observation and spent 10 minutes explaining the technical constraints. She didn't need to establish dominance through knowledge. Her confidence was internal, and it made everyone around her sharper. Friday brought the first real test of his cover. Marcus was standing near the communications center, reviewing the routing of an intelligence report when Captain Dennis Walsh, no relation to Jennifer, approached him with a stack of files. "You," Walsh said, pointing at him. "I need these logged into the system by noon. This is administrative work, should be straightforward." He didn't ask Marcus's name, didn't confirm he was qualified to handle classified material. Just assumed that anyone wearing an officer's uniform in a secured area could be tasked with administrative work. Marcus accepted the files without comment. "I'll get these processed right away, sir." What Walsh didn't know was that Marcus was observing him, a man who delegated without clarity, who assumed competence without verification, who treated junior personnel as interchangeable parts rather than individuals with specific skills. The files were indeed processed within the hour, correctly indexed and secured. When Walsh picked them up, he grunted an acknowledgement and walked away without saying thank you. By the weekend, Marcus had developed a comprehensive mental map of the base's social structure. There were the arrogant leaders like Rodriguez and Walsh, who commanded through fear and assumption of superiority. There were the excellent leaders like Captain Jennifer Walsh, who built trust and earned loyalty. There were the competent but invisible middle managers, doing their jobs without drawing attention or criticism. And there were the junior personnel, the ensigns, petty officers, and junior enlisted staff, who were the true barometer of base morale. They were eager, curious, and their behavior reflected the kind of leadership they experienced daily. On Monday morning of the second week, Marcus received his first indirect test. He was in the base's logistics office, reviewing inventory systems, not because he needed to, but because understanding supply chain management revealed how efficiently a military installation operated, when he noticed a discrepancy. A shipment labeled as arriving Thursday had been marked as received, but inventory didn't match the manifest. Marcus carefully documented the discrepancy and brought it to the attention of Lieutenant James Murphy, the logistics coordinator. "Sir, I noticed the incoming shipment from Thursday. The medical supplies from San Diego Medical Depot shows received in the system, but the inventory count is short by approximately 40 units of IV fluid." Marcus presented this information carefully, offering the observation as a helpful note rather than a criticism. Murphy's initial reaction revealed everything. First, he looked defensive, as if being informed about a problem in his area was a personal attack. Then he saw Marcus, someone he believed to be support staff, beneath him in the hierarchy, and his expression shifted to mild annoyance. "Yeah, that's probably just a clerical error. I'll get to it," he said dismissively, turning back to his computer. "Of course, sir," Marcus said, but the damage was done. He'd learned that Murphy was the type who would delay addressing problems until they became crises, who resented being held accountable by someone he perceived as junior. 6 months from now, that discrepancy would likely cost the base time and resources because Murphy hadn't addressed it when it was small. By the end of the second week, Marcus's notebook contained 50 pages of observations. Names, behavioral patterns, decision-making styles, moments of integrity and moments of compromise. He documented how officers treated those they thought couldn't affect their careers. He'd watched how decisions were made when people thought nobody important was observing. He'd seen the true character of the base revealed not in official inspections or formal evaluations, but in the small, daily interactions that nobody thought mattered. What nobody realized was that everything mattered. Every gesture of kindness toward a junior officer, every moment of patience during a mistake, every decision made with integrity when expedience would have been easier. These small moments were what Marcus had come to evaluate, and so far, the results were both illuminating and sobering. The base was competent, but competence without character was just a well-oiled machine. True leadership, the kind that produced loyalty, inspiration, and genuine excellence, was rarer than he'd hoped and more precious than anyone realized. The strategic operations briefing was scheduled for 1400 hours on a Thursday afternoon, and Marcus knew it would be significant before the meeting even began. He'd overheard conversations in the corridors, caught fragments of operational planning, and reviewed the preliminary briefing documents that had circulated through secure channels. The Pacific Operations Planning Session would determine sealed deployment schedules for the next 3 months, affecting multiple operational theaters and dozens of personnel assignments. It was exactly the kind of meeting where his presence could either remain invisible or become unavoidably relevant. The conference room was austere and functional, the kind of space designed for serious work rather than comfort. A long table dominated the center, with tactical maps covering one wall and a multimedia display system along another. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the particular staleness that came from secure, windowless military spaces. Marcus arrived early, as he always did, positioning himself in the back corner near the communications equipment. Not so far away as to be obviously excluded, not so close as to appear participatory. The perfect distance for an aide taking notes. Commander Derek Hayes entered with his usual measured confidence, carrying a leather portfolio and the kind of unshakable bearing that came from leading elite combat teams. Behind him came Captain Marcus Reeves, the Joint Operations Coordinator, and Major Thomas Rodriguez, the same Rodriguez who'd been curt with the junior lieutenant during the previous week's intelligence briefing. Reeves was competent and thoughtful. Rodriguez was brilliant but arrogant, the kind of officer who believed his strategic insights elevated him beyond normal accountability. "Gentlemen," Hayes said, settling into his seat at the head of the table, "let's begin with Reeves's preliminary deployment proposal." Captain Reeves stood, activating the multimedia display. A complex operational map appeared, showing the Pacific Maritime region with highlighted zones indicating suspected terrorist activity, intelligence gathering points, and allied military positions. "We're proposing a 3-phase deployment," Reeves began, his pointer moving across the map with precision. "Phase 1 involves reconnaissance missions in the Western Pacific, focusing on the Malacca Strait region. Phase 2 transitions to direct action operations against identified targets in Southeast Asia. Phase 3 consolidates intelligence and prepares for potential expansion into the Indian Ocean theater." The plan was methodical, well-researched, and on its surface appeared sound. Marcus listened carefully, his eyes moving from the map to the faces of the men in the room. Hayes was nodding slowly, taking notes. Rodriguez was leaning forward, engaged. Several junior officers seated along the periphery were scribbling notes. But there was a problem. a significant, potentially catastrophic problem that nobody else in the room had caught. Marcus's mind worked through the logistics quickly, almost automatically. The extraction timeline for Phase 2 operations was compressed, dangerously compressed. The plan called for SEAL teams to conduct direct action operations within a 48-hour window, then withdraw via helicopter extraction to a designated offshore platform. But the timing of that extraction window created a vulnerability. The plan didn't account for the regular patrol patterns of the opposition force in that region. According to the intelligence briefings Marcus had reviewed, opposition naval assets operated on a specific schedule that would place them directly in the helicopter's extraction corridor during the proposed window. It was a small detail, the kind of thing that could be easily overlooked in a briefing room where people were managing dozens of variables simultaneously. But in combat, small details killed people. Small details got soldiers killed. Marcus's hand moved across his notebook, sketching the problem, the patrol routes, the timing conflict, the dangerous overlap. He didn't raise his hand, didn't call out the problem immediately. Instead, he waited, watching as Rodriguez began to voice his enthusiasm for the plan. "This is excellent work, Captain. The timeline is aggressive but achievable. I'd recommend we move forward with Phase 1 immediately, begin Phase 2 operations within 30 days. That's when Marcus made eye contact with Hayes. Just a brief glance, a moment of connection across the conference room. Then he shook his head, a subtle, nearly imperceptible movement. Not a dramatic gesture, not something that would draw obvious attention, just enough for Hayes to see it to register the disagreement. Hayes, who had spent years commanding SEAL teams, who had learned to read his personnel with the precision of a chess master, immediately recognized the significance of that gesture. Hayes had not achieved his position by dismissing subtle input from unexpected sources. More importantly, Hayes had learned through bitter experience that the best strategic insight sometimes came from unexpected places, from people who weren't invested in defending a particular proposal, who had no ego tied to their analysis. "Wait," Hayes said, raising his hand slightly. His tone was casual, almost conversational, but it carried immediate authority. "Let me reconsider the extraction timeline. Captain Reeves, walk me through the logistics of the Phase 2 extraction window again, particularly in relation to the opposition force patrol schedules we documented in the latest intelligence summary." Rodriguez's face flashed with irritation. The interruption disrupted the momentum of agreement, but Reeves, a professional to his core, immediately pulled up the relevant intelligence data. As he reviewed the patrol schedules, his eyes widened slightly. "Ah," he said quietly. "I see it. There's a 40-minute window where the opposition force would be positioned directly in the helicopter extraction corridor. We'd have zero margin for error." "Exactly," Hayes said, though he wasn't looking at Reeves. He was looking at Marcus, a brief acknowledgement that passed between them like a secret handshake. "We need to reconsider the timing. What if we shift Phase 2 operations by 6 hours? Would that create sufficient clearance from the opposition patrol routes?" The room shifted. What had been a straightforward approval process became a recalibration session. Reeves worked through the revised timeline, checking and rechecking against the intelligence data. Junior officers scribbled new notes. Rodriguez sat back in his chair, clearly unhappy that his enthusiasm had been dampened, but unable to argue with tactical necessity. 45 minutes later, a revised plan emerged, one that maintained operational objectives while eliminating the dangerous vulnerability. It was a minor adjustment, the kind that only mattered if you were the soldier whose life depended on that 6-hour timing difference. Hayes had orchestrated the entire reconsideration without ever specifically crediting the source of his strategic insight. As the meeting concluded and personnel filed out, Marcus remained in his corner, notebook in hand, looking like he'd simply been recording meeting minutes. Junior Lieutenant Patrick Chen lingered behind the others, clearly puzzled. "Did you see that?" he asked his colleague, Ensign Robert Walsh. Commander Hayes just changed everything. It was like he suddenly spotted something everyone else missed. Yeah, that was strange, Walsh agreed. One minute we're approving the plan, the next minute we're redesigning it. Hayes is incredible, just has that intuitive sense for tactical problems. Neither of them noticed Marcus watching from the corner, understanding that Hayes's intuitive sense had nothing to do with intuition and everything to do with paying attention to people who saw what others didn't. Neither of them would ever know that their safety margin on the Phase 2 extraction, the margin that might save their lives, had come from an unassuming officer taking notes in the back of the room. This was the nature of Marcus's influence, invisible, deniable, rooted not in authority but in competence and trust. Hayes would never publicly credit Marcus with the tactical insight. Such public acknowledgement would undermine everything Marcus was trying to accomplish. Instead, the influence would remain unspoken, operating in the spaces between words, in the looks that passed between two men who understood that in military operations, the difference between success and tragedy was often the quality of attention paid to overlooked details. As Marcus left the conference room, he made a mental note. Hayes was the kind of leader worth commending, a man secure enough in his own position to listen to unexpected input, perceptive enough to understand its value, and humble enough to improve his plans without needing credit. The base, it seemed, had at least one truly exceptional officer. Now the question was whether anyone else would recognize it. The emergency alarm was subtle, just a soft chiming from the operations center at 300 hours on Tuesday morning, 3 days before the critical SEAL deployment was scheduled to launch. For most personnel sleeping in the barracks, it was nothing more than a distant inconvenience. But for the command structure of Naval Base San Diego, that sound marked the beginning of a crisis that would either be quietly resolved or catastrophically derail months of operational planning. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, the base's IT systems coordinator, was the first to fully understand the scope of the disaster. He'd been conducting routine system maintenance when the primary server cluster had suffered a critical failure, not from external attack, not from malicious interference, but from a cascading hardware failure that nobody had anticipated. The redundant systems, designed to protect against exactly this kind of incident, had failed to activate properly. The result was that the base's entire logistics management system had gone offline, and when the backup recovery protocols finally engaged, they recovered corrupted data. By 400 hours, Morrison stood in the operations center looking at screen after screen of corrupted files. Deployment schedules showed contradictory information. Supply manifests had reverted to outdated versions. Personnel assignments were incomplete or duplicated. The system that coordinated the movement of equipment, personnel, and supplies for the entire base was essentially unusable. In military operations, such a failure wasn't merely inconvenient, it was catastrophic. How long to recover? Captain Jennifer Walsh, the intelligence director, asked Morrison. She'd been called in despite the early hour because logistics failures affected every operation running on the base. Unknown, Morrison said, and the word hung in the air like a curse. The corruption is extensive. Best case, we're looking at 48 hours of manual data reconstruction. Worst case, we're looking at a full system rebuild from archived backups, which could take a week. A week? That meant the deployment would be delayed. Months of planning, coordination with allied forces, intelligence gathering, all dependent on the schedule that now existed only as corrupted bits on a crashed server. Captain Walsh's jaw tightened. She immediately reached for her secure communications device. I need to notify Commander Hayes immediately. Within 30 minutes, the crisis had spread through the upper echelons of base command like an infection. Commander Hayes arrived in the operations center with Major Rodriguez close behind him. The operations center, normally a model of calm military efficiency, had transformed into something resembling chaos. Officers huddled around computer terminals. Communications specialists conferred in urgent whispers. The weight of a major deployment failure hung over everything. "Options?" Hayes asked, his voice cutting through the noise with surgical precision. "We're working through it," Morrison said, but his exhaustion was evident. He'd been staring at corrupted data for 3 hours, and the magnitude of the problem was visibly wearing on him. "We have archived backups, but they're from 72 hours ago. That means any changes made since Saturday are lost. We'll have to manually reconstruct everything updated over the past 3 days. That's thousands of entries. It's not impossible, but it's time-intensive," Hayes finished, "and we don't have time." It was Rodriguez who voiced the worst-case scenario. "We postpone. We issue the delay notification to Pacific Command, notify our allied operations partners, reschedule the personnel. It's messy, but it's the only option that guarantees accuracy." The room went quiet. Postponement meant failure, not in an operational sense but in a strategic one. The entire Pacific Theater was coordinating around this deployment. Intelligence operations depended on specific timing. Allied forces had adjusted their own schedules based on the expected SEAL arrival. A postponement would send ripples through multiple command structures. That's when Marcus entered the operations center. He wasn't rushing, wasn't dramatic, just appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee in one hand and a calm expression that seemed almost anachronistic given the crisis surrounding him. The junior officers around the periphery barely registered his presence, but Commander Hayes's eyes found him immediately, and something in Marcus's demeanor, the slight tilt of his head, the focused intensity of his gaze, suggested he understood what was happening. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison," Marcus said, stepping forward with an ease that suggested he belonged in this conversation. "May I?" He gestured toward the primary terminal. Morrison, desperate and exhausted, didn't hesitate. "Sure, if you see anything I'm missing." Marcus settled into the terminal chair, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced precision. He pulled up the system logs, scrolled through diagnostic information, and accessed backup files with the familiarity of someone who'd performed these operations hundreds of times. His eyes scanned across lines of code and data structures, while the entire operations center watched. "When was the last full system backup?" Marcus asked, not looking away from the screen. "Saturday, 600 hours, Morrison said. "And the recovery protocols attempt to restore from the most recent complete backup." "Yes, but..." "The problem isn't the backup," Marcus said, still typing. "The problem is that the recovery algorithm is trying to integrate corrupted transaction logs on top of the clean backup. You're layering bad data onto good data." His fingers moved faster now, accessing deeper system architecture. There should be transaction logs from the backup point forward, isolated in a separate partition. If those haven't been corrupted, we can manually parse them and rebuild the missing entries without the cascading corruption. "I didn't think," Morrison began, but Marcus was already several steps ahead. "The isolated logs are here," Marcus said, pulling up another window. "Still intact. Now the system should have a data reconstruction utility in the maintenance protocols. If we can access that and run it against the isolated transaction logs, it can rebuild the corrupted data structures without reinfecting the entire system." He worked for the next 6 hours, his fingers steady, his focus absolute. Morrison worked alongside him, learning in real time how to navigate the system's deeper architecture. Other IT personnel who arrived as the morning shift began contributed their expertise. But Marcus remained the center point, the one who seemed to understand the system not just as it was designed, but as it actually functioned, with all its particular quirks and vulnerabilities. By 1,000 hours, the first reconstructed data began flowing back into the system. By 1,400 hours, the system was fully operational, all schedules and manifests restored and accurate. The deployment, scheduled for Friday, would proceed on time. The crisis, which 48 hours earlier had seemed insurmountable, was resolved. Captain Jennifer Walsh found Marcus afterward as he was walking toward the commissary. "That was remarkable," she said. "Where did you learn all that? The system administration, the recovery protocols, all of it." Marcus smiled with the kind of humility that comes from genuine competence. "Picked it up over the years," he said simply. The phrase became his signature. Picked it up over the years. Over the following weeks, it would be repeated in whispered conversations throughout the base. The mysterious aide who seemed to know everything about systems, protocols, and procedures. The quiet officer who could solve impossible problems with his eyes closed, who appeared when crises struck and disappeared just as smoothly. The man who picked things up over the years. But nobody connected the dots. Nobody asked themselves how an aide could possess such comprehensive knowledge. The contradiction was too great, the assumption of his position too deeply rooted. Instead, they simply accepted the mystery, filed it away, and moved forward with their missions. Marcus Sterling had hidden himself not just in obscurity, but in plain sight, behind a shield of competence so profound that it became invisible. The notification came through secure channels at 7:30 hours on a Wednesday morning, and it hit Naval Base San Diego like a controlled detonation. Admiral James Whitmore, the highest-ranking officer in the entire Pacific Command, was arriving for an unannounced operational inspection. Not in 3 days, not tomorrow, today, approximately 6 hours from notification. The ripple effect was immediate and comprehensive. Officers began checking uniform inspections. Junior personnel scrambled to ensure every corridor gleamed. The command center received orders to have all operational documentation organized and accessible. Supply areas underwent rapid inventory reviews. Security protocols were elevated. The entire base transformed into a machine of controlled urgency. Everyone moving with purpose. Everyone aware that the highest authority in their operational theater was coming to observe them. Commander Hayes received a separate encrypted communication that most of the base didn't know about. The inspection was being conducted at Admiral Whitmore's personal discretion, which meant it was comprehensive and would likely focus on operational authenticity rather than cosmetic perfection. Whitmore was known for penetrating beneath surface appearances, for understanding whether a base actually functioned excellently or merely appeared to function excellently when observed. Hayes understood the stakes. An admiral's evaluation could determine career trajectories, operational budgets, and strategic positioning within the Pacific theater. By noon, the base had achieved that particular state of military precision that comes with high-level inspections. Every surface polished, every uniform pressed, every document organized. The facade of perfect order that high commands expected, regardless of whether it reflected actual operational reality. There was a particular kind of dishonesty embedded in such preparations. The base was presenting its best self rather than its real self. Admiral Whitmore would need to look beneath the presentation to understand what was actually happening. Marcus observed the preparation with quiet amusement. He understood what was occurring, the performance of readiness rather than the practice of it. Officers who'd been cutting corners would suddenly work efficiently. Personnel who'd been casual about protocols would suddenly demonstrate perfect adherence. The base was, for the next 24 hours, playing a character rather than being itself. Whitmore's job would be to see through that performance, and Marcus's job, his secret job, was to observe how well people transitioned between their authentic selves and their performed selves. At 13:30 hours, Admiral James Whitmore's motorcade arrived at the base's main gate. The Admiral was a man in his mid-60s, with the particular bearing that came from decades of command. Silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with the kind of physical presence that made people instinctively straighten their posture. He wore his dress uniform with the casual precision of someone who'd earned every decoration and insignia through significant sacrifice and service. When Whitmore entered a room, people felt it. When he asked a question, people answered carefully because they understood his attention was rarely wasted on anything trivial. Commander Hayes greeted him with formal precision. "Admiral Whitmore, sir. Welcome to Naval Base San Diego. We're honored by your visit." "At ease, Commander," Whitmore said, his tone suggesting that he'd skipped the pleasantries and moved directly to understanding what he'd come to evaluate. "I want to observe normal operations, not presentation. Show me what actually happens when I'm not here." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The base had been transformed into a presentation, and Whitmore was explicitly requesting that they stop presenting. It created an awkward contradiction. How could they show normal operations when everything had been elevated to inspection-ready status? The answer was that Whitmore would observe beneath the surface anyway, noting which personnel seemed tense, which procedures seemed artificially formal, which areas showed signs of rushed preparation. The Admiral's walkthrough began with the command center. He observed the tactical maps, reviewed operational status reports, and asked questions that revealed his comprehensive understanding of Pacific operations. He complimented specific decisions, questioned others, and made notes in a leather journal that probably contained observations no one would ever fully understand. He moved from the command center to the intelligence briefing room, then to the communications hub, then to personnel quarters. The tour was methodical and exhausting, not exhausting for Whitmore, who seemed to operate at a perpetual level of focused intensity, but exhausting for the officers accompanying him. They never knew what question would come next, never knew whether they were being evaluated on tactical knowledge, personnel management, or something else entirely. It was around 1600 hours when something shifted. The Admiral had moved to the Operations Analysis Center, a quieter section of the base where strategic planning occurred. This was where Marcus had been working, not officially assigned, just present, as he had been throughout his time on the base. He'd been reviewing long-range operational forecasts, cross-referencing them with intelligence assessments, making notes on strategic vulnerabilities. Admiral Whitmore's entourage moved through the Operations Analysis Center with the usual efficiency. Officers provided briefings. The Admiral asked questions. Documentation was produced on demand. It was professional and accomplished and ultimately unmemorable. But then Whitmore's eyes fell on a figure in the corner of the room, partially obscured by a tactical analysis station. A man in an unmarked uniform, neither young nor old, reviewing operational projections with the focused intensity of someone who understood what they were reading. The Admiral's entire body language shifted, not dramatically but noticeably. His forward momentum slowed. His attention narrowed. Marcus was concentrating too deeply on his analysis to notice the Admiral's regard. He was absorbed in cross-referencing intelligence data with operational timelines, identifying a potential strategic vulnerability in a proposed deployment pattern. His brow was furrowed with concentration. His fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up comparative data, building a logical argument for why a particular strategic assumption was flawed. Admiral Whitmore's eyes remained fixed on Marcus for nearly 30 seconds, a psychological eternity in military environments where attention is typically distributed across multiple points of interest. Commander Hayes, noticing the Admiral's focus, tensed slightly. Whatever was capturing Whitmore's attention, it wasn't on the official briefing materials. "Commander," Whitmore said quietly, his eyes still on Marcus, "who is that officer?" Hayes's response was careful. "Support personnel assigned to tactical analysis, sir, part of the operational evaluation rotation." Whitmore nodded slowly, but his gaze didn't shift. Marcus remained unaware of being observed, still engaged with his analysis. There was something about the way Marcus moved through information, the efficiency of his research methodology, the apparent depth of his understanding, something that registered with Whitmore on a level beyond mere observation. Whitmore turned back to the briefing materials, but his attention had been fundamentally altered. A part of his consciousness remained fixed on that figure in the corner, on the mystery of who this person was, and why his presence seemed to carry weight that his ostensible position didn't explain. As the entourage continued its tour, Whitmore made a note in his journal. Not a word, just a question mark, followed by a single initial. He would find out who that officer was. Not immediately, that would be too obvious. But before his inspection concluded, he would understand the true identity and significance of the man in the corner. The Admiral's final hours at Naval Base San Diego would not proceed as planned. Admiral Whitmore's decision came quickly, made in that decisive way of men accustomed to commanding fleets and shaping military strategy. He'd observed something in that corner, a presence, a competence, a familiarity that didn't align with the position described. 30 years of military command had given Whitmore an almost preternatural ability to recognize when something fundamental was being concealed. Not maliciously, but deliberately. Someone was hiding in plain sight, and Whitmore intended to understand why. He excused himself from Commander Hayes under the pretense of reviewing additional operational documentation. Instead, he quietly accessed the base's personnel database through a secure terminal in the command center. It took less than 3 minutes to understand. The support aide assigned to the base was listed as Lieutenant Marcus Sterling, with clearances that made no sense for a support position. The clearances were comprehensive. They granted access to classified operations, strategic planning, personnel evaluations. They were the clearances of someone far more senior than any aide should possess. But the real revelation came when Whitmore checked the service record. He had to read it twice to fully comprehend what he was seeing. The name matched. The date of commission matched. The career trajectory matched. Vice Admiral Marcus Sterling, one of the most respected commanders in the entire Pacific Theater, had somehow inserted himself into Naval Base San Diego as a support aide without any formal notification to the inspection command structure. Whitmore's first reaction was professional respect. This was the kind of operation that only the most confident, most self-assured senior commanders could execute. Most officers with that rank and authority would arrive with fanfare, would expect deference, would conduct inspections from a position of obvious power. Sterling had chosen invisibility instead. That choice revealed something profound about his character, that he was more interested in truth than in being impressed by facade. Whitmore's second reaction was understanding. This was why Hayes had seemed oddly confident. This was why critical tactical decisions had been corrected mid-meeting. This was why impossible problems had been solved with apparent ease. Vice Admiral Marcus Sterling had been observing everything, evaluating everything, measuring the base not on its presentation but on its authenticity. The Admiral now had a decision to make. He could acknowledge Sterling directly, could blow his cover immediately, could demand an explanation for why the highest-ranking officer in Pacific operations was conducting covert evaluations on his own. Or he could play the game, could allow Sterling to maintain his invisibility, could observe how the Vice Admiral intended to reveal himself. Whitmore chose a third option. He would force the revelation, but in a way that would communicate respect and recognition rather than betrayal or disruption. It was the move of a superior officer who understood the value of what Sterling was doing and wanted to honor it. The opportunity came at 16:45 hours, as the Admiral's entourage moved through the common operations area. This was the corridor Marcus had been using as a pathway between briefing rooms and analysis stations. It was a high-traffic area, never empty, always filled with junior personnel, officers, and support staff moving between assignments. Marcus was walking from the intelligence hub toward the tactical analysis center, his mind still engaged with the strategic vulnerabilities he'd been analyzing, when he nearly collided with Admiral Whitmore's group. The corridor suddenly filled with more authority than it had probably ever contained. The highest-ranking officer in the Pacific Theater with his full entourage of aides, security, and command staff. Marcus stepped aside respectfully, the way anyone would when encountering a senior official. He began to move past the group with the kind of invisibility that had become his armor, but Admiral Whitmore stopped walking. His entire entourage stopped with him, sensing that whatever was about to happen, it was significant. "Vice Admiral Sterling," Whitmore said, his voice carrying clearly through the corridor. The air seemed to stop moving. Several officers in the vicinity froze. Marcus's forward momentum halted. His expression registered surprise, the first truly unguarded emotion anyone had seen from him during his entire time on the base. Whitmore walked directly toward Marcus, closing the distance between them. Every eye in the corridor watched. Junior officers realized they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would be discussed in whispered conversations for months afterward. The base commander appeared at the far end of the corridor, sensing the significance of the moment, and stopped in place. "Sir," Marcus said, recovering his composure with impressive speed, "I wasn't expecting—" "I know," Whitmore interrupted. His hand rose, and in a movement that would echo through Naval Base San Diego's history, Admiral James Whitmore came to full military attention. His spine straightened. His shoulders squared. His right hand rose in a crisp, formal salute, the kind of salute typically given to the president, to generals of commanding status, to those who occupied the absolute apex of military hierarchy. The admiral was saluting the aide. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nothing happened. Junior officers' faces went pale. The base commander's eyes widened. Several personnel in the corridor literally stopped breathing. Every protocol, every hierarchy, every assumption about rank and authority was being inverted in a single gesture. Marcus returned the salute with practiced precision. His hand rose, his posture became formal, his bearing transformed from the quiet competence of an aide into the unmistakable authority of a vice admiral. The two senior officers, separated by only a few feet, remained in their salute posture for nearly 10 seconds, an extraordinarily long time for military protocol. As they lowered their hands, Admiral Whitmore offered the slightest nod, a gesture of respect between two men who understood the significance of what had just occurred. The message was clear: I see you. I recognize what you've been doing. I honor it. "I apologize for the disruption to your operation, Admiral," Whitmore said, deliberately using Sterling's proper title for the first time. "I should have coordinated directly rather than proceeding without notification." "Not at all," Sterling replied, and his voice carried a different quality now, the voice of someone no longer hiding, no longer performing. "Your inspection was comprehensive and necessary. I appreciate the professionalism your team has demonstrated." The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, but it transformed everything. Word rippled through the base instantaneously. The admiral saluting the aide, the revelation that Sterling held the rank of vice admiral, the sudden recalibration of every interaction that had occurred over the past 3 weeks. In the officers' mess, junior lieutenants began assembling the pieces. The mysterious aide who'd solved impossible IT problems, the quiet observer in strategy meetings, the person who'd caught the extraction timeline vulnerability. All of it suddenly made sense. All of it suddenly revealed itself as the work of someone far more senior than anyone had suspected. Commander Hayes, watching from his position near the operations center, allowed himself the faintest smile. He'd known all along, of course. He'd been part of this operation since its conception. But seeing Whitmore recognize Sterling, seeing the salute that inverted the hierarchy, seeing the base's collective understanding shift in real time, it validated everything they'd been trying to accomplish. Marcus Sterling, now identified and no longer concealed, stood in that corridor understanding that his evaluation had fundamentally changed. He'd intended to remain invisible for the entire deployment, but Whitmore had recognized him anyway. The admiral's recognition, delivered through that unprecedented salute, communicated something Sterling had spent his entire military career trying to understand. That true authority transcends rank, that genuine respect is given to character rather than insignia, and that the most powerful leaders are those who acknowledge excellence wherever they find it, even in subordinates, even in those expected to be invisible. The evaluation would continue, but it was no longer covert, and somehow that made it infinitely more meaningful. The briefing room was crowded with officers by 1900 hours that evening. Word had spread through the base's command structure like a controlled fire, and now the senior staff was assembled to understand the implications of what had occurred. Vice Admiral Marcus Sterling stood before them in his proper uniform, insignia gleaming, bearing transformed from the quiet Aide into the unmistakable presence of one of Pacific Command's highest-ranking officers. Beside him stood Admiral James Whitmore, and between them sat Commander Derek Hayes, whose role in the operation was now being revealed. "For the past 3 weeks," Sterling began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of command, "I've been conducting an unannounced operational evaluation of this facility. I did not arrive as the Vice Admiral commanding Pacific Strategic Operations. I arrived as support personnel because I wanted to understand how this base actually functions when leadership doesn't know it's being observed." The room was absolutely silent. Officers who had dismissed him, who had assigned him clerical tasks, who had explained basic protocols to him as though he were learning for the first time, suddenly understood the magnitude of their exposure. "The evaluation wasn't about tactical operations," Sterling continued. "We have metrics for tactical proficiency. We have performance reviews and operational assessments. What we don't have, what we can't easily measure, is character. We can't measure integrity through traditional inspection protocols. We can't evaluate leadership authenticity through official channels. So I came here to observe how officers behave when they believe nobody important is watching." Major Thomas Rodriguez, the operations officer who had snapped at a junior lieutenant weeks earlier, felt his chest tighten. His name was in that evaluation, Sterling's observations of that moment when he'd chosen irritation over mentorship. Sterling walked to a tactical map on the wall. "Commander Hayes was selected for this evaluation specifically because I needed to assess whether he was willing to accept input from unexpected sources. In a military context, ego often overrides judgment. Senior officers sometimes become so invested in their authority that they dismiss valuable input simply because it comes from a subordinate." Sterling paused, looking directly at Hayes. Commander Hayes passed that test completely. When he received a subtle indication that his tactical plan contained a critical vulnerability, he immediately reconsidered. He didn't defend his work. He didn't assume his rank meant his analysis was correct. He was willing to adjust strategy based on information, regardless of its source. Hayes nodded slightly, acknowledging both the compliment and the lesson embedded within it. "I also observed," Sterling said, his tone becoming more serious, "how personnel were treated when they were believed to be junior support staff. Some of you treated the aide with consistent respect and professionalism, regardless of his perceived rank. You answered questions thoroughly. You demonstrated integrity in small moments when nobody was watching. You behaved as though character mattered more than hierarchy." He pulled up a list on the display screen. Names appeared, officers whose behavior during Sterling's evaluation had reflected genuine integrity. Captain Jennifer Walsh was among them. So was Ensign Robert Chen, the young officer who had helped with Sterling's bag on the first day and had continued treating him with respect even as weeks passed. "However," Sterling said, and the word landed heavily in the room, "I also observed officers who conduct themselves differently based on perceived authority. Officers who are kind when senior officials are watching but dismissive or harsh when they believe they're dealing with subordinates." More names appeared on the screen. Major Rodriguez was there. So was Captain Dennis Walsh, the officer who had assigned Sterling tasks without even asking his name. The silence in the room had transformed. What had been shock was now becoming understanding. Understanding that this evaluation had been comprehensive, that it had documented not just operational competence but moral character, that it had recorded how people behaved when they thought nobody important was watching. "I also want to address something specific," Sterling said, pulling up another document. "Approximately 5 days ago, there was a logistical discrepancy in our medical supplies inventory. Lieutenant Murphy in logistics was informed of this discrepancy by someone he believed to be support personnel. His response was to defer action, to treat the problem as minor, to assume it would resolve itself. That is not how critical systems work. That is not how logistics work. Every discrepancy is a symptom of potential system failure." Lieutenant Murphy felt sweat breaking on his forehead. He thought the problem had simply gone away. In reality, it had been documented, observed, evaluated. "The good news," Sterling continued, "is that I also want to highlight how this base responded to crisis. 3 days ago, when the logistics management system failed completely, I observed remarkable professionalism. Lieutenant Commander Morrison worked tirelessly to identify solutions. Officers adapted to changing circumstances. Personnel worked beyond their normal duties to restore critical systems. That is exactly the kind of performance that military operations depend upon." Sterling walked forward, and the officers in the room straightened instinctively. "Here is what my evaluation has revealed. Naval Base San Diego is operationally competent. Your tactical capabilities are excellent. Your strategic thinking is sound. Commander Hayes is an exceptional leader, the kind of commander who leads through integrity rather than authority. But like many military installations, this base has officers who understand that leadership means something different than rank. And it has officers who have not yet made that distinction." He paused, letting that statement settle. "I will be submitting a comprehensive evaluation to Pacific Command. Some of you will receive commendations. Some of you will receive recommendations for advancement. And some of you," he looked directly at Rodriguez and Captain Walsh, "will receive assessments that reflect a gap between your competence and your character. That gap will be addressed through command structure, through mentorship, and through opportunities to demonstrate growth." Sterling's expression softened slightly. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone's career. I came here to understand the truth about this installation and the people who lead it. The truth is more complex than simple competence or failure. The truth is that every one of you has the capacity to be better, to lead more authentically, to make decisions based on character rather than convenience." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of genuine feeling. "The most important lesson I've learned from this evaluation is that people are watching all the time. Not me, not officially, but your personnel are watching. Your junior officers are watching. Your teams are observing how you make decisions, how you treat others, how you behave when you think nobody important is paying attention. Because to them, you are the most important thing. You shape their understanding of what military leadership means. You model either integrity or its absence." Sterling looked at each officer in the room, one by one. That is what this evaluation was really about. Not tactics or operations or strategic planning. It was about understanding whether this base's leaders understand that the measure of a commander is not what they display on their chest, but what they demonstrate through their actions when they believe no one is watching. Commander Hayes watched Sterling with the kind of respect that comes from understanding someone deeply. This had been Sterling's real mission all along, not to expose failures, but to illuminate truth. Not to destroy, but to educate. Not to assert authority, but to demonstrate that true authority emerges from character. Admiral Whitmore, observing the room's reaction, understood why Sterling had been selected for the highest ranks of Pacific Command. Because Sterling didn't lead through fear or intimidation. He led by revealing truth and trusting people to respond to it with integrity. 3 weeks after Vice Admiral Marcus Sterling's identity was revealed, Naval Base San Diego had fundamentally transformed. Not in obvious ways. The barracks still gleamed, operations still ran smoothly, deployment still occurred on schedule. But something deeper had shifted in the culture of the base. something that couldn't be measured in metrics or documented in official reports. It existed in the way officers interacted with junior personnel, in the kinds of decisions being made, in the conversations happening in corridors and mess halls after official business concluded. The transformation began the day after Sterling's briefing, when Commander Hayes called a mandatory all-hands meeting for SEAL Team 7 and its support personnel. Junior officers and enlisted personnel filed into the assembly area, uncertain what they were being summoned to discuss. Hayes stood before them with a quiet authority that had somehow deepened since Sterling's revelation. "I want to tell you something," Hayes began, and the room immediately fell silent. "3 weeks ago, you were working with someone you believed to be a support aide. That person was Vice Admiral Marcus Sterling, the highest-ranking officer in Pacific Strategic Operations. He spent those weeks observing how you conducted yourselves, how you treated others, and how you made decisions when you thought nobody important was watching." The room erupted in whispers. Hayes raised his hand for silence. "I'm telling you this because you need to understand something fundamental about military leadership. The people you work with are always observing you. The junior enlisted personnel are watching how senior officers treat them. Your peers are watching how you make decisions. Your subordinates are watching how you conduct yourself when you think the stakes are low. Every single action you take contributes to a culture that either elevates integrity or erodes it." Hayes paused, letting that sink in. Vice Admiral Sterling came here to evaluate this base's operational readiness, but the most important thing he discovered wasn't about tactics or strategy. It was about character. And I want you to know that the officers on this base who treated the aide with consistent respect, who answered his questions thoughtfully, who demonstrated professionalism regardless of perceived rank, those officers are now being recognized as exemplary leaders. That's what excellence looks like. That's what command of troops looks like. That's what military leadership actually means. The message rippled through the base. It was subtly different from traditional command structure communication. It wasn't about obedience or hierarchy. It was about understanding that character mattered more than rank, that integrity was the only sustainable foundation for authority. Over the following weeks, several concrete changes emerged. Major Rodriguez, faced with documentation of his dismissive treatment of junior personnel, requested transfer to a different facility. His career trajectory had been altered by a moment that he'd thought was insignificant, by a junior officer's question he'd answered with irritation rather than mentorship. He was not destroyed. Sterling wasn't interested in destruction. But he was given an opportunity to understand that leadership meant something different than he'd previously conceived. Captain Jennifer Walsh, conversely, received a promotion recommendation. Her intelligence briefings, which had always encouraged questions and treated junior personnel as valuable contributors, had impressed Sterling profoundly. She was promoted to command a larger intelligence operation, and her advancement came with explicit recognition that her leadership style, collaborative rather than hierarchical, was exactly the kind of approach the military needed. Ensign Robert Chen, the young officer who had offered to help Sterling with his bag on the first day, received an early advancement recommendation and was selected for a leadership development program typically reserved for officers with significantly more experience. His consistent professionalism, his demonstrated respect for all personnel regardless of perceived rank, his willingness to treat everyone with dignity, these qualities had been noted. He would become an officer who understood from his earliest advancement that character preceded authority. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, the IT coordinator who had worked 18 hours reconstructing the logistics database with Sterling's guidance, was offered a position on Sterling's personal command staff. The offer was both recognition of competence and opportunity. Morrison would work directly with one of Pacific Command's most respected strategists, would learn military operations from someone who understood the intersection of technology and tactical planning. But perhaps the most significant change was more subtle. Throughout the base, officers began asking themselves different questions before making decisions. If I didn't know someone's rank, would my actions still be the same? Am I making this decision because it's right or because it's convenient? Who is watching me, and what message am I sending through my choices? The evaluation report that Sterling submitted to Pacific Command was comprehensive, and in military circles became legendary. It wasn't a standard inspection document. It was a philosophical treatise on military leadership, drawn from weeks of observation and documented interactions. The report praised Naval Base San Diego's operational excellence, but went deeper, analyzing the relationship between character and competence, between authentic leadership and performed authority. Sterling wrote, "A military installation can be operationally sound while being morally compromised. A base can execute flawlessly on paper while failing in the daily moments that shape the culture of those who serve there." This evaluation attempted to understand what happens when observers don't know they're being observed. What I discovered is that this base contains within itself both exceptional examples of authentic leadership and cautionary examples of leadership rooted in ego rather than service. The challenge for all military installations is recognizing that true authority emerges not from rank, but from the consistency of character demonstrated across all interactions, regardless of who is watching. The report was studied in military academies. Leadership seminars began using Sterling's evaluation methodology as a model for understanding organizational culture. Senior officers started conducting their own variations of unannounced evaluations, inserting themselves into situations without formal designation to understand authentic behavior rather than performed readiness. Admiral James Whitmore's salute in that corridor became iconic. Military photographers had captured it, and the image circulated through command structures, an admiral saluting an officer initially perceived as subordinate. The photograph accompanied articles about leadership, integrity, and the true nature of military authority. What Whitmore had communicated through that single gesture, that excellence deserves recognition regardless of rank, that character commands respect beyond hierarchy, became a touchstone for military culture discussions. But perhaps the most lasting impact was something impossible to quantify. Naval Base San Diego's next generation of officers, the ensigns and junior lieutenants who had witnessed Sterling's evaluation, who had understood that character was being observed and documented, who had seen peers recognized or transferred based on integrity rather than competence alone, developed a different understanding of what military leadership meant. They understood that you can be tactically proficient and strategically sound, while still failing as a leader if you lack character. They understood that the people watching you matter more than the people evaluating you formally. They understood that military hierarchy exists for operational necessity, but true authority emerges from demonstrated integrity. 6 months after Sterling's departure from the base, a group of junior officers gathered for an informal discussion about military ethics. One of them, a young lieutenant who had interacted with Sterling without knowing his identity, said something that captured the essence of the evaluation's lasting impact. "The Admiral didn't come here to fix what was broken. He came here to illuminate what matters. And the thing that matters most isn't what we can measure, it's who we choose to be when we think nobody important is watching. Except now we know someone is always watching. We're watching each other. Our personnel are watching us. And that changes everything about what leadership means." That understanding, that shift in perception about what military excellence actually meant, was the true legacy of Vice Admiral Marcus Sterling's evaluation. Not commendations or transfers, not policy changes or organizational restructuring, but a fundamental recognition that authentic leadership and demonstrated character were inseparable, and that the most profound military operations began not with strategy but with integrity.